Picture this. April 9th, 1241. You're a Polish knight standing in a muddy field near the town of Legnica. Across from you, stretching all the way to the horizon, is the most terrifying sight in medieval warfare, the Mongol Horde. These aren't ordinary soldiers. They're the deadliest military force on the planet. They've annihilated armies from China to Persia. They've burned thousand-year-old cities to ash. They've killed millions. And now they're here, in Poland. Your commander, Duke Henry the Pious, has assembled every knight willing to fight. Poles, Germans, Templars, anyone brave enough to stand, maybe 25,000 men total. The Mongols have about 20,000. You actually outnumber them slightly. For the first time, you think maybe, just maybe, you have a chance. But here's what you don't know yet. In 3 hours, Duke Henry will be dead. Your army will be completely shattered, and the Mongols will build a pyramid from the severed heads and ears of your friends that will take days to count. The Battle of Legnica will become one of the worst catastrophes in medieval European history. A massacre so complete that Polish mothers will frighten their children with stories of Mongol raiders for the next 50 years. But here's the twist. This isn't where Poland's story ends. It's where the real fight begins. Because 47 years later, the Poles will face the Mongols again. And this time, everything will be different. This is the story of how Poland went from total annihilation to stunning revenge, from complete defeat to breaking the unbreakable enemy. And it's way more epic than you think. To understand Poland's comeback, you need to understand what they were facing in 1241. The Mongols weren't just another invading army. They were a civilizational apocalypse unlike anything Europe had ever encountered. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but his empire was still expanding aggressively. His descendants ruled everything from Korea to Eastern Europe. They destroyed the Jin dynasty in China, completely annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, crushed the Kievan Rus into submission. Everywhere they went, the same brutal pattern repeated. Swift invasion, total destruction. Absolute terror. And here's what made them truly terrifying. The Mongol military system was decades ahead of medieval Europe. While European knights fought in heavy armor on horseback, relying on individual bravery and feudal obligations, the Mongols fought as a perfectly coordinated machine. Every single Mongol soldier was a trained horseman from early childhood. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Their composite bows could pierce European armor at 300 yards. They used sophisticated signaling systems with flags and drums to coordinate complex battlefield maneuvers. They employed spies, used psychological warfare, and mastered tactical deception, a standard practice. In late 1240, a massive Mongol army under Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan himself, invaded Eastern Europe. The army split into multiple columns, each with specific strategic targets. One massive column headed for Hungary. Another column, commanded by Mongol generals Baidar and Kadan, turned directly toward Poland. And this is where Poland made its first fatal mistake. They didn't understand what was coming. The Mongols didn't just want plunder or tribute. They wanted to create a massive buffer zone of completely devastated territory where no army could ever challenge them again. Poland stood directly in their path. The invasion was systematic, calculated, and absolutely brutal. The city of Sandomierz was destroyed. Krakow, one of Poland's greatest cities, was burned to the ground. Dozens of smaller towns were completely erased from existence. The Mongols used terror as a deliberate weapon, massacring entire populations to discourage any thought of resistance anywhere else. By spring of 1241, Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia realized he had to act immediately. If the Mongols weren't stopped right now, all of Poland would cease to exist as a kingdom. It would become nothing but smoking ruins and mass graves. Henry assembled a coalition army at Legnica. Polish knights formed the fighting corps. But he also brought in German knights, Teutonic knights, and even some Templar volunteers. It was one of the largest Christian armies assembled in Central Europe in decades. They had numbers. They had courage. They had the best armor and weapons medieval Christianity could produce. They thought they had a chance. On April 9th, 1241, the two armies finally met on the plains near Legnica. And what happened next would haunt Poland for nearly half a century. The battle started with the Mongols doing what they did best, the feigned retreat. Mongol light cavalry charged directly toward the European lines. They fired massive volleys of arrows into the masked knights. Then they turned around and ran. The European knights, who had been trained for centuries to pursue fleeing enemies, took the bait immediately. They charged. They broke their careful formation. They chased the retreating Mongols across the open field, thinking they were winning, thinking the enemy was running in terror. This was exactly the trap the Mongols had set. Once the European knights were completely spread out and totally disorganized, Mongol heavy cavalry units that had been waiting in concealment smashed into them from both flanks simultaneously. At the same time, other Mongol units deployed thick smoke across the entire battlefield. Some chronicles claim they used burning chemicals or some kind of primitive smoke bombs, though historians still debate this detail. Whatever they used, the result was catastrophic. The European army completely disintegrated. Knights who moments before had been confident in their numerical advantage and superior armor suddenly found themselves surrounded, isolated, confused by smoke, and cut down methodically. The tight formations that had worked perfectly for centuries against other European armies were completely useless against Mongol mobile tactics. It was like fighting an enemy from the future with weapons and strategies from the past. Duke Henry desperately tried to rally his collapsing forces. It was hopeless. The battle had already been lost. He and his personal bodyguard attempted to flee the battlefield. They didn't make it far. Mongol cavalry units ran them down within minutes. What happened next became dark legend across all of Europe. The Mongols cut off Duke Henry's head. They put it on a spear and paraded it around the entire battlefield while his army was still dying. Then they began the grim work of accounting for their victory. Mongol military tradition required physical proof of enemy casualties, so their soldiers systematically cut off the right ear of every single European corpse on the field. According to multiple medieval chronicles, they filled 9 large sacks completely full with severed ears, thousands and thousands of them. The slaughter was so complete, so overwhelming, that for years and years afterward, Polish mothers would tell their misbehaving children, "Be quiet and behave, or the Mongols will come for you in the night." But here's what's interesting. The Mongols didn't occupy Legnica. They didn't garrison the city or try to hold the territory. They didn't need to. They had made their point with absolute clarity. They moved on, heading south to link up with the main Mongol invasion force that was simultaneously devastating Hungary. But then something completely unexpected happened, something that would save all of Europe purely by accident. In December of 1241, Golden Khan, the great Khan ruling the entire Mongol Empire from distant Mongolia, suddenly died. By strict Mongol law and tradition, all princes of the royal blood had to immediately return to Mongolia to participate in electing a new great Khan. Batu Khan, who was leading the European invasion, withdrew his entire massive army. They turned around and headed east, back toward Mongolia. Europe had been saved not by military genius or heroic resistance, but by pure political accident thousands of miles away. But the damage to Poland was already catastrophic. Entire regions were completely depopulated. Krakow was reduced to smoking ruins. Thousands were dead. The economy was shattered. And the Battle of Legnica entered deep into Polish collective memory as horrifying proof of how close Christian Europe had come to total annihilation. But here's what the Mongols didn't realize. Poland was learning. And what Poland learned in those dark years would eventually change everything. For the next 47 years, Poland lived constantly in the long shadow of Mongol power. The Golden Horde, the Mongol state that controlled the vast western steppes, regularly launched devastating raids into Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary. These weren't full-scale invasions like 1241, but they were absolutely devastating nonetheless. Villages burned, crops destroyed, people killed or dragged away into slavery. The terror was maintained year after year. But something fundamental was changing beneath the surface, something the Mongols didn't see coming. The knights, who had somehow survived Legnica, and the entire generation of warriors who came after them carefully studied what had happened. They analyzed the disaster in detail. They realized that charging blindly at mounted archers, no matter how brave or well-armored you were, was pure suicide. They learned to properly use defensive terrain. They developed completely new tactical approaches. They built stronger, more sophisticated fortifications. They trained differently. They thought differently. And slowly, methodically, patiently, they began preparing for revenge. By the 1280s, Poland was a fundamentally different military power. Duke Leszek, the Black of Krakow, had systematically rebuilt the kingdom's entire military structure. But more importantly, much more importantly, Poland now had experienced allies who had also been fighting the Mongols. The Lithuanians, who had been battling Mongol raiders for decades, freely shared their intelligence and hard-won tactical knowledge. The Hungarians, who had suffered their own catastrophic Mongol invasions, actively coordinated their defensive strategies with Poland. Poland wasn't just rebuilding what had been destroyed. Poland was evolving into something new. Polish commanders meticulously studied every single Mongol raid that occurred. They carefully noted patterns, the feigned retreats, the flanking maneuvers, the use of terrain and mobility, the psychological tactics, and they systematically developed specific counters for each one. They trained massed crossbowmen to effectively match Mongol horse archers. They drilled defensive formations that couldn't be easily broken by cavalry charges. They strictly disciplined their knights to refuse to pursue fleeing enemies into obvious ambushes. The Polish military of 1288 was fundamentally completely different from the army that had been destroyed at Legnica in 1241. And the Mongols were about to find out just how different. In 1287, a significant Mongol raiding force led by a commander named Talabuga crossed the border into Polish territory. They expected the same easy victories they'd been winning for nearly 50 years, the same pattern, the same terrified enemy, the same brutal success. they were catastrophically, fatally wrong. The first major sign that everything had changed came at the Battle of Lublin. A Polish army, actually smaller in numbers than the Mongol raiding force, completely refused to engage in traditional open-field battle. Instead, they systematically harassed the Mongols from carefully prepared fortified positions. They used aggressive hit-and-run tactics. They denied the Mongols any easy targets or opportunities for their signature maneuvers. The Mongols, who had grown accustomed over decades to enemies either fleeing in terror or charging at them recklessly, were genuinely frustrated. This wasn't how battles were supposed to work according to 50 years of experience. Then came the truly decisive moment, the Battle of Krakow in either 1287 or 1288. The exact year is debated by historians because medieval chronicles conflict with each other. The specific tactical details are somewhat murky because different sources tell different versions. But what is absolutely clear, what every source agrees on, is that Duke Leszek's Polish forces decisively defeated a major Mongol raiding party near the city of Krakow. And this wasn't Legnica. This was something completely different. The Poles didn't take the bait of the famous feigned retreat. When Mongol cavalry units charged forward aggressively and then suddenly turned to flee, Polish knights held their positions. They didn't pursue. They stood firm. Meanwhile, Polish crossbowmen, carefully positioned behind strong defensive lines, poured volley after volley of heavy bolts into the Mongol cavalry. The composite bows that had terrorized all of Europe for half a century finally met their tactical match. When the Mongols tried to execute their signature flanking maneuvers, they discovered that Polish forces had actually anticipated exactly these moves. Reserved cavalry units immediately moved to counter. The open field that should have been the Mongols' natural advantage suddenly became contested ground. And when the fighting inevitably moved to brutal close-quarters combat, the Mongols found themselves in exactly the kind of fight where heavy European armor and larger war horses created a decisive advantage. The battlefield descended into chaos and confusion, but this time, for the first time in nearly 50 years, the chaos clearly favored Poland. Mongol units that attempted to retreat and regroup found their escape paths systematically blocked. What should have been a manageable raid turned into a costly disaster. The Mongol raiding force was badly mauled. They took heavy casualties, far heavier than they'd experienced in Poland for decades. The survivors retreated east in disorder. And here's the crucial historical point. They never came back in significant force, not to Poland, not like before. This might not sound as dramatic as a massive pitched battle with 100,000 warriors, but in the context of 13th century warfare and grand strategy, this was absolutely revolutionary. Poland had finally figured out how to effectively fight the Mongols. More importantly, they had proven in actual combat that their new methods worked. Over the next several years, Polish, Lithuanian, and Hungarian forces increasingly coordinated their defensive operations. Mongol raids into the region became noticeably less frequent, less successful when they did occur, and much more costly in terms of Mongol casualties. By the 1290s, the Golden Horde had largely stopped launching raids into Poland. The simple strategic calculation had changed. It just wasn't worth the cost anymore. The nightmare that had begun at Legnica in 1241 was finally over. So what exactly had transformed Poland so completely between 1241 and 1288? How does a nation go from catastrophic defeat to effective resistance against the most successful conquerors in human history? First, they learned from catastrophic failure instead of being destroyed by it. Legnica had taught them with brutal clarity that traditional European cavalry charges against Mongol armies were suicide, so they adapted. They used fortifications intelligently. They coordinated infantry and cavalry in new ways. They absolutely refused to be drawn into the same tactical traps. Second, they built genuine strategic alliances. Poland alone still couldn't defeat major Mongol forces, but Poland working together with Lithuania and Hungary created an effective defensive network. Intelligence was shared, responses were coordinated. Mutual military support made Mongol raids far riskier than before. Third, military technology had evolved significantly. By the 1280s, European crossbows were substantially more powerful and far more widespread than in 1241. Castle construction techniques had advanced considerably. Polish armor had improved. These might seem like small incremental advantages, but in medieval warfare, small advantages accumulated into decisive edges. Fourth, the Mongols themselves had changed. By the 1280s, the Golden Horde was far more interested in complicated internal politics and growing conflicts with other rival Mongol Khanats than in further conquering Europe. When Poland made raiding genuinely costly, the Mongols had other higher priorities. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, the psychology had fundamentally shifted. The Polish warriors of 1288 weren't fighting with the same desperate, terrified mindset as the doomed knights at Legnica. They had grown up in a Poland that had survived the Mongols. They had trained specifically to fight this enemy. They knew from experience and study that the Mongols were beatable. That confidence, that knowledge, made all the difference in the world. This story isn't just about interesting military tactics or medieval battles. It's about something much deeper. It's about civilizational resilience in the face of existential threat. The Battle of Legnica could easily have been the permanent end of Poland as a kingdom. The country was utterly devastated. Its duke was dead. Major cities were smoking ruins. The population was traumatized. The economy was shattered. But Poland rebuilt. Poland learned. Poland adapted. And eventually, Poland fought back successfully. This exact pattern would repeat itself throughout Polish history over the next 700 years. Invasions, foreign occupations, multiple partitions. Poland would face existential threats again and again and again. And each time, somehow, Poland would survive. Today, there's a monument standing at Legnica commemorating the battle. It properly honors Duke Henry and all the brave knights who died there fighting impossible odds. But maybe, in a way, it should also commemorate what came after the defeat. The 47 long years of patient rebuilding, the grinding, unglamorous work of systematically learning how to fight an enemy that had seemed completely unbeatable. The eventual hard-won victory that came not from one single dramatic heroic battle, but from persistence, adaptation, and absolute refusal to accept defeat as permanent. The Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. They conquered more territory than Rome ever did, more than Alexander the Great, more than anyone before or since. They seemed unstoppable, but they never conquered Poland, not permanently. Legnica broke the Polish army in 1241, but it didn't break Poland itself, and by 1288, Poland had learned exactly how to break them back. The Mongol threat to Central Europe effectively ended in the late 13th century. The Golden Horde gradually turned its military attention eastward and southward. Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary working together had finally proven that invading and holding Central Europe cost far more than it was worth. The nightmare faded. But Poland never forgot the lessons. Generations later, centuries later, Polish military thinking still clearly reflected the hard lessons learned from fighting the Mongols. The critical importance of mobility, the value of good intelligence, the absolute need for flexible, adaptive tactics instead of rigid doctrine. These principles became deeply embedded in Polish military tradition. In a very real sense, the Mongols actually made Poland stronger. The kingdom that slowly emerged from the ashes of the 1241 invasion was more militarily sophisticated, more politically unified, and far more strategically aware than the loose collection of feudal duchies that had existed before. Terrible adversity had forged genuine resilience. If you want more stories about nations that survived their absolute darkest moments and came back stronger, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what historical comeback story I should cover next. Poland's survival of other conflicts? Other nations that successfully defeated the Mongols? Let me know what you want to explore. Until next time, remember this. History isn't just about who won or lost individual battles. It's about who learned from their mistakes, who adapted when everything seemed lost, who refused to quit even when quitting seemed like the only rational choice. At Legnica in 1241, Poland lost absolutely everything. By Krakow in 1288, they had figured out how to win. That's not just military history. That's a powerful lesson for anyone, anywhere, facing impossible odds. The Mongols thought Poland was permanently finished after Legnica. They thought one catastrophic defeat had ended Polish resistance forever. Poland had very different ideas, and 47 years later, they proved it.